Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. I am going to just get my little screen share going here. And I have a setup here where I've got the whole gallery view. So love having folks video on if you're in a place where it's safe to do so. Then I can see the exact moment when I've put you to sleep. And I have the chat open as well, so I'm happy to keep an eye on that as we go. And if you want to raise a Zoom hand or just unmute or use the chat, I'm happy to be interrupted and to engage in conversation at any point. What I'm going to do is just share a little bit about who I am and kind of my personal story. And the story of the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative, where I operate from, to sort of set the context for our most recent work around the theme of systemic investing and systems-aware investing and the role that systems tools like our En-ROADS climate simulation can play in that. So that's kind of the general terrain that I'm going to be exploring here. So to start off, just some fun sort of storytelling. So I live here in Boston now, but I was born and grew up in Boulder, Colorado, where you can, people talk about tree huggers. There's a reason to hug trees, which is that ponderosa pines smell like butterscotch or chocolate if you get close up to the sap. And I grew up hiking in this little park here, where you could look out over the city of Denver, which had this kind of brown cloud looming toward Boulder. And that was a context for my dad to talk to me about pollution control devices and cap and trade policies and other very pragmatic solutions to it. My mom was an activist, and the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons facility, which is off to the right side of this picture, she and her buddies would go join in a circle and lay down in the road to stop the cars from coming in. I was neither of these. I was sort of a computer nerd, playing games like Sim Earth, where you could play God and try to solve climate change. So probably destined to end up at MIT in some capacity. But the most important lessons were about what my parents were actually doing professionally. My dad invented a wheelchair cushion and series of wheelchair seating products that prevent pressure sores and other health complications for paraplegics. My parents built that company together. My brother and I were child labor in the factory, and then eventually, we sold those businesses, and now we've built 3 companies as a family. I sit on the board of the 3rd one. So I just thought that what everybody did was create businesses that were trying to solve important problems in the world, and then I met the real world where my first attempt to kind of do something useful with my life was .com startup that I created in '99, working on tools for parents and teachers of young children. And when we were going out for our major fundraising effort in early 2001, and the .com bubble was bursting and the market was collapsing, and people were looking for things that had real business models with real executives behind them, I put on a backpack and went traveling around the world as one of those sort of hippie backpackers. And being a mountain kid, went to the Himalayas, and the experience of being there was analogous to the experience I had in Colorado, where you're in this incredible place, but you're looking out over this brown cloud over Delhi, and one day stumbled on a dried riverbed full of trash, and just started thinking about there was all this excitement about, I'd get on a train and people would be bringing flat screen TV or air conditioner to a place that never been before. But the brown cloud over Delhi was like a completely different level from what I would experience in Denver. We now know that, around 10 million people die every year prematurely from air pollution. And so it really was this collision between growth and environments, the sort of sustainable development. And so I became obsessed with this topic. I really wish Kindles had been invented, because I had about 15 pounds of books in the bottom of my backpack for those 6 months. But I got to read books like Natural Capitalism by Hawken and Levins and The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. And it got me thinking about, okay, maybe I can work in education and educational technology, but in service of trying to solve these big world problems and trying to tackle this tension or challenge around sustainable development. And so that work, that question or that challenge or that tension, had me sniffing around for where could I find leverage points for making a difference on these questions. And I had been exposed to some of the systems thinking ideas in Sengi's book that harken back to Donella Meadows and others, saying, with this idea from system science of how can you find places where, rather than having the policy resistance experience of more and more effort going into less and less impact, can we have the experience of finding leverage, which means putting in a serious but measured amount of effort in order to produce an outsized result. And I've sort of ever since this moment in my life and career been looking for leverage and trying to find sort of where are the places where we can try to move the needle. Because of having read Sengi, I was really drawn to MIT. I ended up coming here at first as a PhD student in 2005, and then since 2010 have been senior lecturer here and director of the Sustainability Initiative, as Liz mentioned in the introduction. MIT is a really cool place. There is a history here of people working on systems thinking approaches to environmental and social challenges. The Limits to Growth book that had come out of the World 3 model, which was the first computational model of human environment interactions, spurred the sustainability movement. There were people like John Sturman and John Ehrenfeld around here who had furthered that conversation. And I knew there was a kind of water cooler conversation happening here about sustainability. And the initiative got off the ground while I was a PhD student. And so I was able to help nudge it along and then took it over in 2010. And essentially during our time together here as an initiative, and I think this is probably true for many of you here in terms of the work that you do, it's also kind of an experience of looking for leverage. Like you're searching around for what are the ways that we might be able to have an impact on these issues that we care about. And one sort of mechanism has been engaging with corporates through the S-Lab course, where we have students working on projects with companies, and that creates an ongoing pattern of engagement. I created a course and did some research and work in sustainability-oriented innovation that got me thinking about startups and growth firms and what is possible through kind of innovation and new development of new business models. Certainly something that I was oriented to from my family and my own experience as an entrepreneur. We started engaging seriously with capital markets over the past 6 years or so, looking at ESG data, looking at the options that institutional investors have to try to drive company behavior. We've engaged with public policymakers, particularly using the En-ROAD simulation tool, which I'll talk about later, and have spun out from our initiative a climate policy center that's sort of a front door for policymakers. But the leverage point that I have been really focused on over the last 6 years or so is one that kind of grows out of my own personal experience I described in being part of a business family, as well as looking at the startups in the sustainability arena and noticing that the impact investing that was providing some of the catalytic capital for emerging climate technologies and other innovations was largely coming from private wealth and families, sometimes multi-generational business families, sometimes entrepreneurs who just cashed out of selling a tech firm, putting capital in with a flexible mandate that could help catalyze other more institutional pools of capital in the markets. And that some of these folks with private wealth are also, for better or for worse, very influential in our democracies, right? As you see with, with like the Koch brothers here in the United States, and in a lot of countries where the policy conversation is being shaped in various ways by people with money using philanthropic and other mechanisms to do so. So I started really exploring and investigating, the sort of the possibilities for private wealth as a set of actors to drive systems change. And this, this ended up dovetailing with the whole conversation about the initial way to look at that is with this idea of impact investing. And I joined forces with Falco Petzold at the University of Zurich, who created a Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth there, and started running programs for members of high net worth families on impact investing. And initially, the idea around impact investing is something like this spectrum, which is there's a lot of different sort of spectra of capital that people have drawn to say it is possible that there's a range of possible investment mandates that people can have, from finance first to impact first is sort of this spectrum, where there's philanthropy, where I'm looking for, I'm expecting negative 100% return on my money, but I'm hoping to have a positive social impact, to a set of, investment options that might be concessionary, where I might try to have an impact by catalyzing other capital into a space by providing, whether it's early stage climate tech entrepreneurship finance or microfinance, microlending. And the impact investing field was really growing over the same period that I'm describing, over the last 10, 15 years. The mechanisms that people are using include active ownership, thematic investing, catalytic capital. But the thing that kept striking me was that coming at this from a systems perspective, was that all of these approaches tend to look at the individual organization as the target of investment, meaning that like, okay, I might invest in a particular startup company in the hopes that that's going to grow and make a big change in the world. And every so often that does happen. I mean, Nancy Fund, who was at DBL Partners, was an early investor in Tesla. And that's an example of a company where a single company has actually made a pretty big dent in the universe in terms of helping to shift toward electric vehicles. But for the most part, if we're going to drive systems change, it's probably not going to happen through individual assets. And it's probably going to be ensembles of activity, portfolios of activity, broader coalitions, and so on. And I was noticing this as a limitation of the impact investing field at the same time that a lot of people were noticing limitations of investing approaches to driving change. And so what is emerging now, which I've become very interested in and am trying to help contribute to as a way to find leverage on all these issues, is what I call the systems turn in finance. Now, my PhD is in organizational behavior. I am not a finance person. I use qualitative methods, but I've learned to speak finance reasonably well over the past 8 years or so, and I'm spending more and more time with these kinds of actors. So what's happening is, some of you may be aware of this, involved in this in various different ways, is that large fiduciary asset owners are starting to talk about system level investing, steward ownership, system stewardship. And I kind of think of this as like ESG 2.0, where pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and others with very large holdings that are diversified across the economy are noticing that I can't just engage with single companies one at a time and hope that we're going to drive a socio-technical transition and that we're going to mitigate these systemic risks. I have to think about the systemic risks to the portfolio as a whole, and I need to think about systems changes that might mitigate those systemic risks. And there's a whole ensemble of organizations that are starting to push in this direction, including even fairly central ones like the UN Principal PRI. I've been weighing in the last couple of weeks on a new framework they have to try to encourage this. But the shareholder commons is, I think, kind of the key sort of backbone organization in this space. They are essentially getting large asset owners to see their role as tackling systemic issues like climate change, inequality, antibiotic resistance that affect the health of their portfolio as a whole, and which they can't really diversify away from. And so they're using systems language to talk about what does it mean to try to tackle these systemic risks. And then on the impact investing side, which I was describing before, the private wealth world, folks are saying, individual companies are not going to solve these problems. I was talking with one investor who was a very early investor in Beyond Meat, and which is an alternative protein company that did an IPO. They made a ton of money on it. They won the game essentially of impact investing, but they sort of won the battle but lost the war, was sort of his perspective. We scaled Beyond Meat, we took it IPO, we made a lot of money on it, but at the end of the day, their product is in the same freezer of the same grocery stores in the same industrial food system. And we set out to change the food system, but we just put another product into it. And so how do we actually change the food system is the question that he and a number of other people are leaning into. So I call this impact investing 2.0 or investing for systems change. And these are folks who are mission-driven capital allocators, and they're starting to come together in ensembles. So the CSP, which is the organization that started at the University of Zurich, which I'm involved with, we do capacity building programs for wealth holders on investing for systems change. There's a community of practice called Twist, which is Together We Invest for Systemic Transformation, which is a group of people who share their experiences in trying to invest for systems change. Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors has been a pioneer in this arena, and is trying to help folks move in this direction. And at the intersection between these two spaces, so these folks tend to be more fiduciary. They have finance first objectives, but even on finance first grounds, they're saying we need to mitigate these systemic risks so that our portfolios can be healthy. These folks are more mission driven, and they're saying we want to invest for systems change to achieve, sustainable development objectives. The intersection is a set of practices that are being labeled as systemic investing, using multi-capital or polycapital, or sort of two terms that are being thrown around, which means investing across asset classes, including philanthropy, but also other forms of capital in the way that Bourdieu would think about it, like social capital and cultural capital and symbolic capital. And so there are some organizations emerging that are trying to define and advance this practice of systemic investing. And I think this is super exciting. I think the potential here is really large. We work most closely with TransCap Initiative. We're doing collaborative projects. We've had funding go back and forth between our organizations, I'm again coming at this from as a sort of qualitative sociologist. I'm sort of looking at this as an emerging field of practice and trying to understand it and encourage it to the extent that it might provide a leverage for change. So just to kind of give you a sense of what these folks are talking about and how they talk, this is a couple of slides. Oh, sorry, and I should say one more thing, which is that there's an organization called FEST that Steve Waddell created, who some of you may know. He's Canadian, to be a field building organization for this whole space of the systems turn in finance. And I am there's a number of sort of communities and subcommunities he's creating. There's a research and knowledge community forming to support systemic investing that that I am involved in leading with Steve. So to give you a sense of what the conversation looks like, this is I'm going to show a couple of slides that Dominic Hofstetter, who is the head of Transcap Initiative, has used to help sort of illustrate. So this is a AI generated image of what a sustainable future society might look like. And so, you've got green spaces for cooling and air filtration, waterways, recreational purposes, infrastructure for pedestrians and cycling, all the things that we might, this kind of, how do we go from kind of our current state to this utopia requires some sort of bigger systemic changes. But the way that we do investment, the way that capital tends to flow is that is that we look at venture capital for vertical farming operations. We look at infrastructure finance for particular buildings or energy infrastructure. We have real estate investing trusts, which might be dealing with the farmland and the buildings. We have carbon markets that are trying to reward people for different kinds of carbon sequestration. There's philanthropy for the community centers and educational institutions. But what's really required is an approach that connects the dots between these in order to drive a systems shift to create this kind of future. So that's the kind of that's an example of the type of rhetoric and thinking that is being put forward here. And so when we go to this kind of spectrum of capital that to describe impact investing, what this perspective calls to mind is that a systemic investing approach would combine all of these in some fashion and seek value and impact amplification through synergy. So rather than portfolios being constructed to diversify and mitigate risk, you would construct portfolios that are mutually synergistic and that produce combined combinatorial effects and share, to be able to produce bigger system shifts. So that's the sort of ideology and idea that is emerging here. And you'll see there's been a variety of kind of manifestos of systemic investing that have been articulated. I think a particularly interesting and useful one is, I'm going to put in the chat here, comes from Dominic and his team at Transcap. Now, Fritjof, you asked the question, systemic, not systematic. So those terms are, those words are used in different ways. They have technical meanings in the finance arena. So systematic risk is related to it's basically like a risk factor that affects portfolios across the board, but they, in a sense, there's still some question as to well, maybe with the right style or whatever, you can mitigate some of those systematic risk factors. Systemic has this notion that there's that the underlying system, underlying economic system that the capital that our economies depend on has some sort of a flaw, and that there is some sort of and a systemic risk would be a risk of those structures and systems failing in some way, like the financial systemic risk that was exposed after the mortgage crisis in the United States in 2008, or this is the risks to the economy of climate change would be examples of systemic risks. And then when we talk about change, investing for systems change, people usually use the term systemic change or systems change. I've never seen people actually say systematic change. Happy to share the slides as a PDF. Yeah, after this session. So this is what people are talking about, and from my orientation is to look at this empirically and to say, how do impact investors behave when they're investing for systems change, given the tension between sort of practicality and complexity? And this was the question that animated a master's thesis that I supervised over the last couple of years. It was released last fall, in which I'll share the link in chat in a moment. And the idea here was that there's no way we were going to be able to evaluate the efficacy of investing for systems change, because it's just too new of a sphere of practice, and the time horizon over which one should expect system changes to occur is too long for us to be able to meaningfully say, these are the best practices, or these are the things that are working or not working. So instead, what we've tried to do is an approach to research that is kind of like a participatory action research, where our goal is to promote reflexivity among the actors involved. So we try to understand what is their intentionality, what's the investor intentionality, the intended systems change, what are the practices that they're actually undertaking, and how are those things aligned? What is the mental model? Can we expose and make the tacit mental models explicit about how their practices are supposed to lead to the changes that they say they want to occur? And so that has been our empirical approach. And what we've done is team up with the communities of practice, particularly Twist, to look at the examples in that space and promote this kind of reflexivity and document the case studies in ways that allow us to bring a critical eye to the practice. So an example of one of these case studies, one of which we actually heard about through our alumni network and brought to Twist, which is kind of fun. Betsy and Jesse Fink, Jesse was the chief operating officer of Priceline, which you may know. It's a travel website. So made good money doing that. He and his wife, when he sold out of Priceline, he and his wife Betsy created a farm, a foundation, and a family office. And Mission Point Partners was their family office. The Fink Family Foundation is their foundation, and they had a family farm, which is kind of like a their next chapter. And you can see some of the jars on the back of things that they produce. And in the course of running their family farm, they noticed how much food waste was occurring in the process of agriculture. And so what they did was they said, this food waste thing is really interesting. Let's see if we can explore this topic through our philanthropy. And then what they did was, as they started to put money into organizations that were food rescue or other kinds of food waste redirection organizations, they started convening people under a literal big tent on their farmland. People would set up the tent for weddings, and then they'd leave the tent up, and they'd bring in a bunch of nonprofits and other investors and incumbent food companies, NGOs, and they funded the NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council, to do a report on food waste that kind of elevated the topic. They started investing in startup companies that do food waste solutions, and then they funded the creation of a backbone organization called ReFed, which coordinates efforts around food waste, and that then created an insight engine to make visible the system of food waste investing and opportunity, which then brought together a funding circle, catalyzing other investment into the space. And so you have this field creation process, essentially, around food waste in the United States that's just very significantly galvanized by this one family. And you've got a whole variety of different nonprofits and institutions and for-profit companies coming into the mix here. And ReFed is sort of documenting and coordinating their efforts. And so for the $5 million or so that the Finks put into this space, there are now about $1 to $2 billion a year flowing into food waste solutions. And I think the current tally is about actually up to 12 billion that have flown into the space. So they've been very catalytic of capital in this arena. And what we did was we wrote up a case study about their work and just published it on SSRN. I just put a link into the chat. And then this case was part of this broader empirical study looking at a whole set of efforts at investing for systems change, some of which were more issue specific and national in scope. So that would be like where the ReFed food waste thing fits. It's the United States Food Waste Challenge. Some of the efforts there were 26 case studies in this initial sweep, and some of them were more issue general. Some of them were more local and place-based. Some of them were more global in scope. And they focused on different socio-technical systems. So some might be focused on mobility, some on agriculture, some on health systems. So what we see is that when people try to invest for systems change, they have to define a boundary around the system that they're trying to change. And those boundaries end up getting defined in terms of issues, in terms of geographies, and in terms of sectors or socio-technical systems. Okay, let me just pause for a second here and field a couple of questions that have come up in chat and open the floor for more. So how far do you see these practices are seeding some turning points for transformative change, shaping new generation social entrepreneurship? I think everything is very early and small and nascent. So I don't know that I mean, I think that this food waste example is pretty cool. And it's something, the reason I knew about it, interestingly, was that I had mentored students at MIT Sloan who started, spoiler alert, which was one of the companies that the Finks invested in. And so I knew about them. And one of our other students had gone to work for the Finks and had developed the initial, what they called their roadmap, their Pathfinder document, to kind of lay out the opportunity here using some of the systems thinking that he had learned here at Sloan. So we had sort of stumbled into this example, and like I said, we brought it into this community. And I think, that's a promising possibility. The other one that there's been some writing about now is that the Walton family, which started Walmart, the grandson of the founder, Lucas Walton, has created an enterprise called Builder's Vision. And Builder's Vision is a systemic investing vehicle, essentially, with focus areas in oceans, energy, and food and agriculture. And there's a case study about the Builder's Oceans line of work, which I will put in the chat as well. Let's see here. And this one, I think it's created a whole space of, there is an oceans entrepreneurship space now that didn't exist and probably wouldn't exist in its current form or scale if not for what Builder's Ocean Strategy did. And so the Transcap wrote a case study about them, which I just pasted into the chat. So I do think that there are certain spaces where this is occurring, and where there's some promise, which is so why this is sort of a cool space to investigate. Ronnie asked me a question in a direct message. Can we design a system where we work backwards, like get the objective set first and then figure out who the various actors would be? And that is exactly what Transcap is advocating for when they're defining systemic investing. So the hallmarks and definitions document that I pasted into the chat, it lays out it lays out exactly that idea that you should start with the system. And so they're doing things like there's a regenerative agriculture systems map that Transcap did using Kumu, which is designed to illuminate the intervention opportunities and the investment opportunities in the regenerative agriculture arena. And that is now helping to identify who the actors should be who could push on the leverage points that they've identified. So you're kind of pure systemic investing in the way that they're defining it starts with the system and the change you want, then goes to the leverage points, then goes from the leverage points to what are the capital requirements to push on those leverage points, therefore, what are the pools of capital you would need, therefore, who are the actors that should be involved. The interesting thing is that that systems-centered point of view, what's sometimes being called a systems capital point of view, is not how most investment actors can operate. Because for the most part, if I'm a venture capital fund and I set up my venture capital fund 5 years ago with a set of LPs with contracts, I am operating in a particular asset class and I'm operating in a particular way. If I want to do systemic investing, I'm not starting with the system and working backwards. I'm starting with, I can deploy this kind of capital and I'm looking for opportunities. So one of the things that we are trying to do, in addition to kind of defining this ideal situation of system-centered investing, is also to ask the question, like, how might we help investors who are operating in a particular way that might be more reductionistic, either because they're looking for particular point solutions to problems or they're working within a particular asset class, to go from sort of reductionistic to the term I'm using right now is systems aware, which would be kind of this intermediary place to be on the way to this systemic investing ideal. And that's like that's a question that we're leaning into now. I have a group of students this fall who are, I paired together with investors to help advance their strategies in kind of an action learning modality. And in that situation, there's a couple of venture capital style firms that we are trying to bring up the ladder to becoming systems aware venture capital, to then being able to participate in ensembles of or ecosystems of systemic investing. Okay. I'll say more about that in a couple minutes, like what I think are the avenues that we have to do that. What we see is that, in fact, a lot of investors do tinker in this direction. So one thing that Albin Yao, whose master's thesis looked at all these case studies, did was that he identified what are the levers of change that investors can push on in order to try to do something towards systems change. And so solution experimentation is what a lot of seed stage and venture capital type plays do, is that they help to experiment and test immature solutions. So if you only did this, then maybe you would just be a venture capital. Some also get involved in scaling those solutions, maybe by providing follow-on or full cycle capital, project finance, and other things to help those solutions scale. So that's where you're starting to get a little bit more of a robust approach. But the folks who are tinkering further are starting to do things like orchestration and network building, like the Finks building Refed, data and knowledge, like the Refed Insights engine, human capitals, like training programs to help relieve human capital constraints, physical infrastructure, engagement with incumbent companies to change their behaviors, building social norms and public awareness, and involving in policy and regulation. This was the kind of inventory that inductively we found of levers of change that people are pulling on. And what you can see is that almost everybody is doing some kind of venture investing, like solution experimentation funded by the investor. There's a few who are trying some of these other things. Albin, I'll leave this to you to read the thesis. He did this kind of archetype analysis to find a clustering analysis to figure out that there were these sort of archetypes of different investor behaviors in terms of how much they were pushing on each of these different levers. But I think the key thing is that the starting point for doing any of this is a shift in perspective. As a shift in perspective to see yourself as an actor in a system, as part of an ensemble of other investors investing in ensembles of solutions that are part of a larger systems change, and looking for ways to contribute and participate meaningfully in those contexts. And I think that is that's an ingredient of this shift. Okay. Couple other questions have come up in the chat. Is there a listserv where we can stay connected to these issues? If you want to be part of a research community that is studying these processes and doing kind of knowledge building and theory building and research around them, please let me know, and email Idongas@Samson is my research scientist here at MIT who is helping to coordinate this community. And I'm putting her email address in the chat so you can reach out to her. And then Fritjof asks, have you engaged with design studies like systemic design or design inquiry? I personally have not. However, many of the examples of the case studies that we've studied have done that. So the array of different cases here, they often will engage with different kinds of consultancies and groups to do design thinking like inquiries. But I would say what distinguishes the systemic perspective is that they're often they're doing some kind of modality to understand the system that they're operating in. And they're either looking at the value chain and the processes involved, that they're trying to remove bottlenecks, or they're using causal feedback loop type thinking to identify feedback loops that they're trying to get going, leverage points in that sense, or they're mapping the network of stakeholders to see where are there disconnected pockets of activity where they could connect the dots, or where are there people who don't have power who should have power, or they are mapping the paradigms, values, and rules that underlie the system that they're trying to shift or change. And the folks who are doing this in the most advanced way, this last piece, are the folks who have a connection to socio-technical transition studies and multi-level perspective, like Johan Scott at University of Utrecht has this thing called Deep Transitions Lab, where they are helping investors make sense of the sets of rules and unwritten and written rules that together sort of hold the system in place, that if you could shift those, you would shift the system. So those are the analytic approaches or methodologies that are being employed here. Once you go to implement a solution, then people might bring more of a design thinking type of perspective to it. So I think this is an arena in which system thinking, system analysis, and design thinking type work can be brought together. Okay. Other questions, thoughts, reactions on this systemic investing space before I share some thoughts on how do we move people up this ladder? Okay. So the one one thing that I am finding has been a very useful door opener for us, and which helps to start some of this shift in perspective, is in the climate arena, a interactive simulation tool called En-ROADS, which we developed here at MIT Sloan in collaboration with Climate Interactive. I don't know if folks have seen this before, but it is the way I think about this, and the way I think about all of these systems analysis approaches in general, is that these maps that people make and these models or simulation tools like En-ROADS serve as boundary objects. So one of the key challenges is if I come back to this idea that we're going to coordinate and align a set of different actors and investments together in an ensemble that drives systems change, they're going to be talking to each other across a lot of different lines, in different communities of practice and different communities of knowledge. And what we know from organizational behavior and from the organizational studies literature, from people like Beth Betschke and Paul Carlisle and others, is that boundary objects are very important. So artifacts that enable people and support people in translating their points of view across different knowledge communities. And a lot of times what these maps of the value chain or the stakeholder network or the system causal structure do is that those artifacts serve as boundary objects to enable people to talk to each other across these lines to coordinate activity toward some kind of systems change. And the boundary object that we have been involved in putting out into the world is this is an interactive simulation tool called En-ROADS. On the top right here, you can see our colleague John Sturman briefing John Kerry, who is the climate envoy for the Biden administration. And down here, you can see me. This is the largest bamboo structure in the world. I'm running a workshop here for 110 cross-sectoral leaders using the climate simulation tool to help people understand the climate challenge. And this ended up, that was really fun. Just a quick side anecdote is that I ran this workshop on a Tuesday. The next day on Wednesday, 10 people who were in here said, we want to learn how to be facilitators using En-ROADS. So I did a facilitator training. The next day on Thursday, one of them translated our materials into Bahasa Indonesian. And then on Friday, he ran a workshop for government leaders in Jakarta. And so that kind of virality of this tool has meant that now we just crossed the 400,000 mark of people who have participated in workshops. around En-ROADS. And we particularly engage around our team, extended team, with top decision makers, which include government, business, and civil society. But what I've been doing is engaging with investors to try to build the systems thinking muscles and perspective of people deploying capital as part of the avenue towards getting investors to become more systems aware, and then to be able to participate in ensembles of activity that are driving systems change on climate. And I found that this is really useful and has been working quite well. So for example, one of the coordination challenges when we're talking about private wealth is that it's one thing when you just have a couple like Betsy and Jesse who cashed out of a startup and have a lot of autonomy to decide where the money's going to go. A lot of private wealth is actually controlled in multi-generational families where you have dozens of cousins who all have some influence over a family office pool of capital, but where they all may have disparate interests and understandings of the situation. And so the first piece of alignment isn't across the different investors, it's actually within the investor to get some alignment. And so this testimonial here is really interesting because this comes from my running a day-long climate day for ultra high net worth family for everyone from the kids to the senior members of the family to the professionals in the family office, where we played a role-playing game around En-ROADS to help everybody understand where the high leverage actions are and to help clarify where they wanted to allocate capital for their climate-related investment pools. And so that was really interesting. I got into that gig because I had run a similar workshop. I'd run a different En-ROADS workshop for a whole community of ultra high net worth investors in climate, again, who were able to, have a conversation about, okay, hey, look, we're investing in a lot of tree planting, which doesn't seem to be having a huge impact on the climate, while we could be investing in energy efficiency, which is a little higher leverage, or we could be getting involved in political activity to price carbon, which could be even higher leverage. And I've seen investors actually redirect their capital pools from lower leverage to higher leverage solutions based on their kind of experiences with this. So the hypothesis that we're exploring is, again, when we come back to this question about how do we help investors go from up this ladder, that systems thinking tools and experiences are a piece of the puzzle, as is the articulation and development of a set of practices for using capital to push on a variety of levers of change and to be part of ensembles of investors who can coordinate their activity to try to drive systems change toward the kinds of futures that we want. So again, in the journey of sort of looking for leverage, for myself personally, this is this is sort of my current bet and exploration. Appreciate all the great comments and questions in chat. I'll try to respond to those in chat in these last couple minutes. I believe that the Innovation North team needs to wrap it up, but really appreciate the chance to engage with folks and share some of what's going on here at MIT.
Thanks so much, Jason. And we have time for maybe one or two quick questions. So we can maybe see if anyone wants to raise their hand to speak to the group. Otherwise, oh, sorry, Tima, go ahead.
Sorry, we have a couple of minutes. So Jason, thanks. That was amazing. And I am just overwhelmed by how we can multi-process so well. doing the chat, talking, managing your slides. Well done. I'm curious specifically, how do you actually use En-ROADS when you have a group of disparate investors in the room?
Yeah. So there's a couple of modalities with En-ROADS. And by the way, in case people haven't played with it, it is free, open source, fully documented, runs on any browser, and the training materials to learn how to be a facilitator are also free and available, and I pasted everything in the chat. There's one modality where you ask a group of people and you just say, what do you think is going to help us solve climate change? And like, what are your favorite ideas and solutions? And someone will say, oh, well, I just invested in this cool, maple syrup operation that plants new trees. And so it's an afforestation play. So I say, great, let's pull the tree planting lever and see what's involved in that. And you just kind of iteratively at people suggesting, oh, wait, I think nuclear energy is really important. Fine, let's pull nuclear fusion. Let's try that. So En-ROADS is designed to try out all the different ideas that people have and to understand how they interact with each other. So that's just a policy testing, what we call the En-ROADS Climate Workshop. There's a second modality where after a short demo along those lines, you put people onto a computer and they say, play with the tool, see if you can create a future that is below 2 degrees, a safer climate future, and which is sort of justifiable. And then you're going to present your scenario to the group. And that is what I call a solution search or a guided work. It's called the guided assignment. There's a lot of materials on the Climate Interact website to do that assignment. All the students coming into Stanford's energy program do that as like a competition now, which is cool. And then the last is a role-playing game. So the role-playing game is you break people up into groups, and it's like a parliamentary game where I'm the Secretary General of the United Nations, and there's a group that's China, a group that's the fossil fuel companies, a group that's Greta Thunberg and the activists, and they're lobbying for different actions. And when someone lobbies for an action, you pull the lever, and then if somebody lobbies to repeal it, you pull it back, and they have to negotiate in the room. And so the people in the room simulate the social political dynamics while the computer simulates the techno-economic and climate dynamics. And it's super fun. It's the most popular thing we do with our students. And it's a great intro to climate. It's a great intro to the whole space. It's what I did with the family when I had the whole extended family. And so depending on the audience and how much time you have with them and how willing they are to play, you can try these different modalities.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think that's a great note to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time and we can't take more questions. But thank you so much, Jason, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really great to see such interest in this topic. So before we sign off, we just wanted to let you know about our upcoming sessions for the Innovation North Speaker Series. So on February 6th, Tobias Luth from ETH Zurich will join us, and Tobias is an expert on regenerative systems and design. And then our next one after that is in March with Josephine Sassen van Meer of TNO, the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. She'll join us on March 27th, and she will share how to implement systems innovation in practice. Jess will post the links in the chat. She just posted them, and we hope to see you all there.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, everybody.